The cold hit Bryn first, ruthless and without warning, stealing the air from her lungs in less than a second. 1 moment earlier, she'd been driving her rusted Honda Civic along Lakeshore Drive, her mind spinning with anatomy terms and medication dosages. It was 5:47 in the morning. Fog blanketed Lake Michigan. Today was her final exam day, the end of 4 years of sleepless nights, 3 jobs at the same time, and 9 years of keeping herself alive since the foster care system had spit her out onto the street. Pass, and she climbed out of the bottom. Fail, and she went back to washing dishes. Then an unusual glint caught the edge of her vision. Her foot slammed the brake. Tires screamed on the wet road. Near the lake's edge, a figure lurched in the black water, about 15 meters from shore. A faint cry for help rose, and the wind swallowed most of it. On the grass, a pair of expensive high heels sat abandoned, and a leather handbag lay tossed aside as if in a hurry. It didn't look like an accident. Bryn tore off her blue scrubs, the uniform she'd planned to wear, straight into the exam room, and ran. December water in Lake Michigan was ink dark, and the undertow yanked like a dead man's hand. She wrapped an arm around the old woman's waist and held tight. "Hold on to me." Every kick was a battle. The scar on her left arm throbbed in the freezing water, but she didn't stop. Her fingers clawed into the muddy bank. She dragged the old woman onto the soaked grass, skin ashen, lips gone purple. CPR, each compression a prayer. The ambulance siren split the morning open. Relief cut through her like a blade. But Bryn didn't know the truth. The old woman she'd pulled from the black water hadn't fallen into the lake. She'd been pushed, and her son was already on his way. A low, expensive engine tore through the fog. A black Escalade rolled to a hard stop by the road, the door shut with a clean, cold sound, like the snap of a gun being locked and loaded. 2 bodyguards built like brick walls stepped out. Then a man appeared, tall, with a face sharp as a knife, and eyes darker than the bottom of Lake Michigan, walking through the fog until he stood looking straight at Bryn. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. That look told her this morning had just changed her life forever. His name was Kane Moretti, the most powerful boss in Chicago, and Bryn Holloway, the orphan girl who'd just saved his mother, was about to pay a price she'd never imagined. She saved a life, but the cost was her own. The story's only just beginning, and the next part won't let you look away. If you want to know the real price Bryn has to pay, like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Share this video too, because maybe someone out there needs to hear a story about courage tonight. The paramedics wouldn't let Bryn ride in the ambulance, but she refused to leave. In the end, a young female police officer drove her to the hospital, a thermal blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her wet hair plastered to the back of her neck, her whole body shaking in uneven waves. Bryn didn't fully understand why she was so determined to follow, only that the image of the old woman's blue lips was still burning in her mind, and she couldn't turn away until she knew for certain that the woman was alive. The hospital the ambulance brought her to was unlike any place Bryn had ever trained. There were no narrow corridors, no rows of plastic chairs, no crying children, no smell of cheap disinfectant. This was a private floor, bathed in soft golden light, with polished stone floors and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases on the reception counter. And bodyguards, everywhere. Men in black suits stood spaced along the hallway, arms folded, eyes sweeping every corner of the space, with the precision of people accustomed to hunting for danger. Bryn counted 4 of them in the short distance from the elevator to the waiting area. She pulled the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the VIP lounge, choosing a leather chair near the door and making herself as small as possible. Kane Moretti was there. She recognized him instantly, even though she didn't yet know his name. The man who'd stepped out of the black Escalade, with eyes darker than the bottom of Lake Michigan. He was pacing in front of the double doors leading to intensive care, his strides long and measured, but something in the tension of his shoulders, in the tight line of his jaw, told Bryn that the calm was only a thin shell over a storm. He looked like a caged panther, fierce, restrained, and ready to explode at any moment. None of the men in black dared to stand closer than 2 steps from him. Time crawled with cruel slowness. Bryn sat there, shaking, soaked, the smell of lake mud still clinging to her skin, watching the clock on the wall tick through each second. She thought about the exam room that was probably handing out test papers right now, about the empty chair marked with her number, about 4 years of sleepless nights slipping through her fingers. But every time she tried to focus on the exam, The old woman's ashen face rose up instead, the wide staring eyes, the weak hands flailing in the black water, and everything else became meaningless. The double doors opened. A salt and pepper-haired doctor stepped out, a clipboard in his hand, his face tired but not grim. Kane stopped instantly, spinning around, his entire body orienting toward the doctor, like an arrow finding its target. The doctor said she was out of danger, severe hypothermia, but thanks to immediate first aid at the scene, her heart hadn't stopped long enough to cause brain damage. She would make a full recovery. Kane's shoulders dropped, just a fraction of an inch, but Bryn saw it. She saw it because she'd spent 4 years learning how to read the human body, the smallest signs most people missed. And in that moment, lasting no more than a heartbeat, Kane Moretti wasn't a crime boss. He was a son who'd almost lost his mother. Then the moment vanished. He said something to the doctor, his voice low and quick, and then he turned. This time, he walked straight toward Bryn. His footsteps made no sound on the polished stone floor, an unnatural silence for a man of his size. The men in black shifted automatically, opening a path, like water parting before the bow of a ship. He stopped in front of her and looked down. Bryn lifted her face, her neck tilting back because he was nearly a head taller than her even when she was standing, let alone now as she sat. His eyes were dark, deep, and cold, colder than the lake water that morning. But there was something buried in them, a flicker Bryn didn't have time to name before it was extinguished. "You saved my mother." His voice was low and flat, almost emotionless, but each word landed heavy as stone. "My name is Kane Moretti. I owe you." Bryn opened her mouth, her throat still raw from the cold water. "I just did what anyone would do. Not everyone would." He said it without argument, not as a challenge, just as a statement of fact. His gaze never left her, and Bryn felt pinned to the chair by it, like a butterfly fixed to a display board. "Anything you need, consider it done." She tried to shake her head, tried to say she didn't need anything, that she was a nursing student and saving a life was instinct, not a transaction. But Kane nodded once, a single decisive motion, as if the conversation had ended before it began, as if her answer didn't change a thing. He turned away and walked into the shadowed hallway leading to his mother's room, the men in black falling in behind him like ghosts. Bryn watched him go, her heart still racing, her hands still gripping the thermal blanket. She didn't know who Kane Moretti was, didn't know what weight that name carried in Chicago's underworld, but she knew, with the primitive instinct sharpened by 19 years of surviving on her own, that the promise he'd just made wasn't kindness. It was a cord, and that cord had just been tied around her wrist, without her ever agreeing to it. Bryn made it back to her apartment close to noon, so exhausted she didn't even bother to shower. She only changed into something dry and collapsed onto the bed. She slept for 14 straight hours, a pitch-black sleep without dreams, and when she opened her eyes, the next day's light was already there. Weak winter sun slipped through the curtains, laying a pale golden streak across the ceiling. She stayed still for a while, staring at that strip of light, trying to convince herself that everything from yesterday had been nothing but a long nightmare. The black water, the old woman's bluish skin, the men in suits, eyes colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan. Then the doorbell rang. Bryn pulled on a hoodie, opened the door, and found a man standing there, nearly 1 meter 90 tall, shoulders as broad as the doorway, a face flat and expressionless, gray eyes looking straight through her as if he were scanning a room instead of seeing a person. He wore a black suit, arms folded across his chest, standing in front of her door, as naturally as if he belonged there. "I'm Briggs," he said, his voice low and level. "Mr. Moretti has arranged for me to ensure your safety and comfort." Bryn blinked. "I don't need anyone to protect me." "Thank you, but you can go." Briggs didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't nod and leave. He simply stood there, silent and unmoving, like a wall made of bone and flesh. Bryn repeated it, slower, clearer. "I don't need you." Briggs looked at her, his gaze unchanged, and said only one thing. "I'll wait downstairs." Then he turned away. Bryn shut the door and stepped onto the balcony to look down. A glossy black Escalade was parked right in front of the building, glittering under the morning sun, huge and foreign among the line of older cars in their neighborhood. Briggs stood beside it, eyes sweeping the street, arms folded. He didn't leave. That night, Bryn checked again. The car was still there. Briggs was still there. The next morning, still there. as if the black Escalade had grown roots into the sidewalk. On the second day, Bryn received an email from her school. She read it twice, then 3 times, certain she'd misunderstood. The nursing department informed her she'd been permitted to retake her final exam. Reason given: a verified medical emergency. No further explanation. No mention of who had intervened. But Bryn wasn't stupid. 3 days earlier, before she'd run into the lake, she'd called the department office to ask about exam deferral procedures, and the answer had been no exceptions, no extensions. Miss the exam and you get a 0. Now, suddenly, there was an exception. Suddenly, there was an extension. She looked at the Escalade through the window and understood. Kane Moretti hadn't only sent a guard, he'd slipped into her life on invisible threads, tugging one string, loosening another, rearranging her world without bothering to ask her permission. On the 3rd day, Bryn opened the paper mailbox downstairs and found an envelope from the hospital. A bill for hypothermia treatment, for the brief evaluation she'd received that morning before she insisted on leaving. She opened it, bracing herself for a number that would make her already thin bank account evaporate. But the line at the bottom of the page read, "Paid in full." No name, no note, just 2 blunt words printed on white paper. Bryn stood in the lobby holding the bill and felt something strange mixing in her chest. A small part of her, very small, wanted to be grateful. Someone had seen her, had thought of her, had looked after her in a way no one had since her mother closed her eyes. But the rest of her, the much larger part, felt afraid. Because this wasn't kindness. This was a 2nd chord, then a 3rd, then a 4th. And she didn't know how many more had already been tied without her noticing. Piper saw the change before Bryn was ready to admit it. Her roommate, red hair, a mouth faster than her hands, a heart wider than the cramped apartment the 2 of them shared. Piper was the only person outside the foster care system Bryn had ever trusted enough to call a friend. And Piper wasn't blind. She saw the Escalade. She saw Briggs. She saw the way Bryn checked her phone with a look she'd never worn before. "Who is it, Bryn?" Piper asked on the evening of the 4th day, sitting on the sofa cross-legged, a steaming bowl of instant noodles balanced on her thighs. "Why is a car more expensive than this entire apartment parked under our building for 4 days straight? Why is that guy with shoulders like a bodyguard standing outside every morning?" Bryn sat at the other end of the sofa, her own noodles gone cold. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That a man she'd met exactly once, who'd spoken only a handful of sentences, had paid her hospital bill, arranged for her to retake her exam, and stationed a giant at her door 24 hours a day. And she didn't know why, except that she'd hauled his mother out of a freezing lake. "It's complicated," Bryn said. And she hated the words the moment they left her mouth because they sounded hollow, because they sounded like a lie. Piper looked at her, brown eyes wide, half worry and half suspicion, and Bryn saw in her friend's gaze the thing she feared most: distance. A small groove, newly formed, between them. That night, Bryn lay in bed listening to Piper's steady breathing in the next room, and stared out the window. The black Escalade sat across the street, lights off, swallowed by darkness, but still there, always there. A street lamp painted a dim orange smear across its roof, and Bryn thought the vehicle looked like an animal lying in wait, patient and silent. With the certainty of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere left to run, she pulled the blanket up to her chest, her hand drifting without thought to the scar on her left arm. And she felt that familiar cold spread along her spine. Not the cold of lake water, not the cold of a Chicago winter. The cold of being watched, of being owned, of having someone else decide for her that her life needed protecting, and she had no right to refuse. The first call came on the 6th day. Bryn was sitting at the kitchen table, her pharmacology book open in front of her, trying to cram for the retake exam the following week, when her phone vibrated and an unfamiliar number lit the screen. She hesitated for a beat, then answered. Kane Moretti's voice poured through the speaker like water into a glass, low, unhurried, polite to the point of almost gentle, and it was that gentleness that sent a colder shiver up Bryn's spine than any threat ever could. He asked if she was doing all right, if she was sleeping well, if studying for the retake was going smoothly. His tone was calm, as if the 2 of them were old friends, as if him calling her on a Friday afternoon was the most natural thing in the world. Bryn kept her replies short and courteous, trying to hold the line. "I'm fine. Thank you." Then Kane said, The retake is next Wednesday, right? 8 in the morning. Room 317, the Health Sciences Building. Bryn stopped breathing. She hadn't told anyone the retake schedule except Piper. She hadn't mentioned which building, which room, which time. She'd only received the details by email that morning. Before she could even ask, Kane continued, his voice still even. Your clinical shifts at Northwestern Hospital on Monday and Thursday. Are they making it hard to study? Because if you need it, I can arrange for you to take a temporary break. Bryn gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles blanched. She had never told him about Northwestern. She had never told him about her clinical schedule. She had never told him anything beyond her name and the sentence, I just did what anyone would do, in the hospital waiting area that night. Where did you get this information? She asked, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. Silence on the other end, stretching for exactly 2 breaths. Then Kane replied, I know what I need to know to keep you safe. No apology, no explanation, just an answer as smooth as glass, reflecting everything, revealing nothing. The call ended politely. Kane wished her good studying, and Bryn sat there watching the screen fade to black with the feeling that someone had peeled her layer by layer in the middle of a crowded street. He knew her exam schedule. He knew the hospital where she trained. He knew the times, the room number, the building. Kane Moretti had someone investigate her, had turned her life over like a notebook, read every page, every line, and she hadn't even known until he quoted it back to her in his own voice. The second call came 2 days later, just as Bryn stepped out of a clinical shift at Northwestern, exhausted, her shoes holding the smell of hospital floors, her hair twisted up, the back of her neck damp with sweat. Kane asked if the shift had been hard, then dropped a comment as lightly as if it meant nothing at all. You should try the cafe on the corner of Clark and Division. They make excellent black coffee, no sugar, just the way you like it. Bryn stopped in the parking lot, late afternoon sun slanting into her eyes. She liked black coffee with no sugar. That was true, but it was a small truth, private, belonging to mornings when she sat alone at the kitchen table, a habit she never mentioned because it was too ordinary, too insignificant to be worth saying out loud. And yet he knew. Thanks, Bryn said into the phone, her voice dry, and she ended the call without waiting for his response. She stood there in the parking lot, Chicago winter wind cutting through her thin coat, and she felt more exposed than she ever had in her life. Not exposed in the physical sense, in a deeper, more frightening way, exposed because someone knew more about her than anyone else in the world, more than Piper, more than she sometimes admitted even to herself. Kane Moretti wasn't only sending a bodyguard, wasn't only paying bills, wasn't only arranging a retake exam. He was collecting her, piece by piece, detail by detail, gathering the small scraps of her life, fitting them together into a complete picture, and holding it in his hands without asking permission. She was a file on his desk, a packet of papers, an object cataloged, labeled, and tracked. In the days that followed, every call from Kane carried one more detail, small and precise, like pebbles he dropped into her pocket, each one light on its own, but together becoming a weight she couldn't ignore. He knew she usually walked home along Halstead. He knew she bought groceries at the small corner market instead of the big store. He knew she skipped lunch when her studying got intense. Each detail was another chord, and Bryn could feel the net tightening around her, gentle and patient, never rushed, exactly the way a spider spins a web, each thread alone thin enough to snap, but together strong enough that nothing gets out. That night, Bryn stood by the window and looked down at the familiar Escalade parked across the street. Briggs leaned against the driver's door, eyes scanning the block, patient as every other night. Piper was asleep, the apartment silent except for the low hum of the heater. Bryn rested her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging a pale smear across it, and her right hand drifted without thought to the scar on her left arm, her fingers tracing the raised line of skin that had healed long ago but had never truly disappeared. Loneliness hit her, not the kind she knew. Bryn had known loneliness since she was 8 years old. She knew its smell, its shape, its weight. The loneliness of an orphan was an empty room, a cry no one heard, a one-person meal. But this loneliness was different. It was new, unfamiliar, and more frightening. This was the loneliness of someone wrapped in another person's power, surrounded by attention she hadn't asked for, known by someone she hadn't chosen. She wasn't lonely because of absence. She was lonely because of presence, because there was too much around her, and none of it belonged to her. The black car wasn't hers. Briggs wasn't hers. The courteous phone calls weren't for her. Everything was for the debt. For Catherine Moretti. For Kane and his world. Bryn was only the nail the cords were tied to. And no one ever asks a nail whether it wants that or not. She stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, both hands on her knees, staring down at the worn wooden floor that she and Piper rented with waitress wages and dishwashing money. This apartment was the only thing she'd built with her own hands. The degree that was almost within reach was the only thing she'd fought for on her own. This life, bruised and tattered as it was, belonged to her, and she wouldn't let anyone, not Kane Moretti and not any boss in any shadowed world, turn it into an object in their collection. The real debt wasn't hers to Kane. It was hers to herself. A debt to give herself a life of freedom. A debt to claim the right to live without asking anyone's permission. The call came on Monday morning, just as Bryn was tying her shoelaces, getting ready for her clinical shift. Kane's voice was shorter than it had ever been. No small talk, no circling. "My mother wants to see you." It wasn't an invitation. Bryn understood that instantly, the way Kane said wants to see carrying the weight of an order, a sentence delivered in the softest possible tone. She wanted to refuse. The rational part of her, the part that had kept her alive for 19 years, the part that had learned to spot a trap before it snapped shut, screamed at her to stay away, because every step closer to this family was a step deeper into the mud. But there was another part, a part she couldn't control, the nurse part, the human part, the part that always ran toward the sound of someone calling for help instead of running away from it, and that part remembered the old woman's purple lips and wondered, is she really all right? Briggs drove her there in silence. He never spoke more than necessary, and Bryn was beginning to grow used to that silence, even to prefer it to Kane's polite calls. The Escalade stopped in front of a building Bryn had never seen. Nothing like the public hospital where she trained, where the halls were always packed, the plastic chairs chipped, and the smell of floor cleaner mixed with sweat. This place was so quiet Bryn could hear her own shoes on the marble floor. The corridor was wide, lit with soft golden light. Fresh flowers arranged in white porcelain vases on every windowsill. Flowers Bryn didn't know the names of, but she was certain each arrangement cost more than her month's rent. Bodyguards were stationed here and there, more discreet than the last hospital, blending into the background like statues in suits. Kane waited outside his mother's door. He wore a dark gray suit, standing perfectly still, back straight, arms at his sides, and when Bryn approached, he only nodded, a small motion, then pushed the door open for her. He didn't follow her in. The door closed, and Bryn found herself alone in a room that was spacious and warm, flooded with natural light from a large window looking out over a snow-covered garden. Catherine Moretti lay in the hospital bed, but even there, even in a patient gown, she gave off something Bryn could only call quiet power. She was thinner than Bryn's blurred memory of that night on the lake, skin wrinkled but clean, silver hair brushed neatly back, and her eyes, those eyes were as sharp as a scalpel, dark and bright, sweeping over Bryn from head to toe with undisguised curiosity. "Come here, my girl," she said, her voice soft as silk, yet every word carrying its own weight, impossible to ignore. She reached out her hand, and Bryn, as if pulled by an invisible cord, stepped to the bedside. Catherine's hand closed around hers, unexpectedly firm, warm enough that Bryn almost pulled back because she'd forgotten what it felt like to be held like that. The sensation of care, of affection, something she'd lost at 8 years old, when her mother's thin hand let go for the last time on a hospital bed. "Not everyone runs into a freezing lake at dawn for a stranger," Catherine said, her gaze locked on Bryn's, unblinking. "Not everyone does that, my girl." Bryn tried to be modest. "I'm a nursing student. Saving people is instinct." Catherine gave a quiet laugh, dry but warm. "Ah, a stubborn one. I like that. My son is stubborn too." Then she began to ask questions. Not the dull, polite questions strangers use to fill silence. Catherine asked about Bryn's life, her family, the road that had led her into nursing, and she asked in a voice Bryn hadn't heard directed at her since her mother died. A sincere voice, a warm voice, a patient voice, the voice of a real mother. And Bryn, who had built walls around herself for 19 years, who had learned not to trust, not to tell, not to open up to anyone except Piper, found herself starting to speak. She told her about her mother, about the hospital, about the flat line on the monitor. She told her about foster care, 4 families in 2 years. She told her about 3 jobs and 4 hours of sleep each night. She didn't speak about her father. She didn't speak about the scar. Some doors stayed locked even to the warmest voice. But she said more than she had ever said to anyone besides Piper. And when she stopped, startled by herself, Catherine squeezed her hand tighter, her eyes shining, and Bryn realized she was moved. Then Catherine's voice lowered. The light in her eyes changed from warmth to something deeper, darker, and Bryn felt the air in the room thicken, like the moment before a storm. "My girl," Catherine said slowly. "I didn't fall into the lake." Bryn stopped breathing. "I was pushed." 3 words. Gentle, clear, and brutal as 3 bullets. Bryn stared at her, lips parted, her mind trying to process the information but skidding over it like tires on ice. Pushed. Not an accident. Not a slip. Someone had pushed this 68-year-old woman into Lake Michigan at dawn in the dead of winter and walked away. Catherine didn't say who. She didn't say why. She only said, "My son has enemies. Powerful enemies. And they thought striking me would bring Kane to his knees." Her eyes brightened, something hard and unyielding flashing there, and Bryn understood why this woman was Kane Moretti's mother. They were wrong. "But you have to understand," Catherine continued, her tone softer now, yet every word barbed. "My son takes debts very seriously, and the danger isn't over." Her hand still held Bryn's, warm and steady, and Bryn suddenly felt the cruel irony of it. The only warmth she'd received since her mother died was coming from the hand of the woman pulling her deeper and deeper into the dark. Catherine smiled, a smile gentle and sincere, and because it was sincere, it was 100 times more frightening than any threat. Because if it had been a trap, at least Bryn could have hated it. But this wasn't a trap. This was affection. And affection, Bryn understood from 19 years of loneliness, was the strongest cord in the world. Stronger than wire, stronger than chains, because it was the only cord people didn't want to cut, even when they knew they should. Catherine's 3 words burned in Bryn's mind for 2 straight days. "I was pushed." She heard them while she studied, while she washed her face, while she lay staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. They spun in circles, colliding, forming a relentless hum, and behind that hum was the question Bryn couldn't answer. If Catherine was pushed, then what was Bryn? The one who had pulled her back up, in the eyes of whoever did it. On the 2nd night, Bryn couldn't sleep anymore. She sat up, took her phone, and called Kane. He answered after the first ring, as if he already had the phone in his hand, or as if he never slept. "I need to see you," Bryn said, her voice harder than she'd intended. "We need to talk, in person." A brief silence. Then Kane replied, his tone even. "Tomorrow, 7 in the evening, I'll have Briggs bring you." He named a restaurant Bryn had only ever seen in a magazine, the kind she flipped through in a dentist's waiting room, looking at photos of expensive food and thinking it belonged to another planet. The next evening, Bryn stood in front of the mirror in her cramped bedroom, staring at the 3 dresses she owned laid across the bed. She chose the simplest one, black fabric, round neckline, no decoration, the one she'd bought on sale at a thrift store 2 years ago for an internship interview. She didn't pick it because it was beautiful. She picked it because it was a silent statement. She was coming as herself, not as the version Kane Moretti's world demanded. The restaurant in the Gold Coast was everything Bryn expected and more. White candles on every table, pale golden light reflecting off silverware polished so brightly Bryn could see her own face warped in a soup spoon. Whispered voices, soft laughter, the scent of expensive perfume braided with butter and herbs, women wearing diamonds, men dressed in outfits that probably cost more than Bryn's rent for an entire year. She stepped through the doors and felt like a foreign object, a speck of dust that had drifted into a jewelry box. Kane was already seated in a private corner at the back, a table tucked behind a carved wooden screen, the kind of spot people booked months in advance, or they were Kane Moretti. He rose when she approached and pulled out her chair with a polished courtesy Bryn suspected had been trained into reflex. Then his eyes swept over her from head to toe, quick and precise, not bothering to hide it. He wore a black 3-piece suit, a white shirt with no tie, and at his cuff a watch Bryn guessed cost about the same as her rusted Honda Civic. He looked like he belonged here, as if this place had been built for him, and Bryn hated that feeling. Hated the imbalance pressing on her shoulders, heavier than her pharmacology bag ever could. Dinner began with surface talk. Kane asked about the retake, about her clinical shifts, about the rest of her program, and every question carried a detail she hadn't given him. a small, sharp proof that he knew more about her life than she wanted. Was your emergency department shift last Thursday hard? I heard there was a serious trauma case that night. Bryn set down her fork and knife, met his eyes, and decided she wouldn't wait any longer. I can't accept what's happening, Kane. You sent a bodyguard. You paid my bills. You arranged my exam. You know everything about me that I didn't give you permission to know. I need it to stop. Kane lowered his wineglass, slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. No anger, no surprise, no defensiveness, only a look, with the patience of someone who had already heard these words many times in his head before she said them out loud. Then he spoke, his voice light as a feather, but each word steel. You are currently under my protection, whether you want it or not. Bryn felt heat rush into her face. Whether I want it or not? Do you hear yourself? Kane didn't blink. My mother was attacked, he said, his voice dropping, each word measured. You saved her. And anyone connected to saving her is now in the crosshairs. My enemies will use any leverage they can find. And you, Bryn, are leverage now. Bryn opened her mouth, then shut it again. Her mind took each word in slowly, painfully, like swallowing glass. Leverage. She was leverage. Your family, Bryn said, almost whispering. What kind of enemies do you have? Kane looked at her, and for the first time Bryn saw something like a smile touch his mouth. But it wasn't a smile. It was cold. It was tired. It was older than he was. My family's business is fairly extensive, he said slowly, and it doesn't always fit inside the boundaries polite society likes to pretend exist. The word hung between them, heavier than air, thicker than candle smoke. Mafia. He didn't say it. She didn't say it. But it was there, sitting between them like a third guest, and they both knew it. Bryn hadn't even had time to react when Kane's phone vibrated on the table, the screen flashing in the candlelight. He glanced down, and Bryn watched his face change in less than a second, from controlled calm to something more primal, jaw tightening, eyes darkening, his body going rigid like a wire pulled taut. He lifted the phone and said only 2 words in a low growl Bryn felt in her breastbone. Handle it. Then he ended the call, set the phone down, and looked at Bryn. His eyes were no longer cold. They burned, dark and fierce, and in the depth of them Bryn saw what Catherine had warned her about. The danger wasn't over. This isn't theoretical, Kane said, his voice returning to evenness, but Bryn could hear the lava underneath. The threat I'm talking about isn't something on paper. It's real. It's happening. And until it's finished, you stay inside my protection. He lifted his glass, took a sip, calm as if he'd just commented on the weather. Bryn sat there in her black thrift store dress, in the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, across from a Mafia boss who had just claimed her life in a voice softer than wind, and she felt that familiar cold spread from her chest into her limbs. Not the cold of lake water, not the cold of winter. The cold of hearing someone say whether you want it or not, and knowing they meant every word. Briggs drove her home in silence. Rain began to fall as the Escalade turned onto the familiar street. Fat drops striking the windshield like fingers tapping on a door. Faster and faster. More insistent with every second. Bryn didn't say a word the entire ride back. She stared out the window but saw nothing except her own reflection on the wet glass, blurred and warped, as if she were looking at another version of Bryn Holloway, a version trapped behind the pain with no way out. She climbed the stairs, unlocked the apartment, and found Piper had turned off the lights and gone to sleep. Steady breathing drifted from the next room, peaceful and unburdened, belonging to a world Bryn had still been standing in 2 weeks ago, but that now felt 1,000 miles away. She didn't turn on a light. She didn't change her clothes. She took the old blanket from the back of the sofa, wrapped it around her shoulders, and stepped onto the balcony. Chicago night rain came down like a waterfall, cold and heavy, turning the street below into a black river glittering with street lamp reflections. The rain drowned out almost everything, but it couldn't drown out the city, because Chicago was never truly quiet. A car horn echoed from the avenue, bass thumped from the bar downstairs, laughter carried from someone on the opposite sidewalk, people walking through the rain and still laughing, still living, still normal. The normal world kept turning. People still went to bars, still dated, still fought and made up, still worried about electric bills and expired food in the refrigerator. And Bryn stood on the balcony looking down, wrapped in a blanket, with the words, whether you want it or not, still ringing in her ears. And she understood she didn't belong to that world anymore. She belonged to the world of black escalades, of bodyguards in suits, of midnight calls, and the word leverage spoken in a flat voice over a white tablecloth. From the next room came the soft sound of Piper shifting in her sleep, the rustle of a blanket, then quiet again. Bryn remembered the day they first moved into this apartment 3 years earlier. No table, no chairs, just 2 mattresses on the floor, and 1 pot used only for boiling instant noodles. The 2 of them sat on the wooden floor, slurping noodles from plastic bowls, and Piper told some story about the cafe boss she worked for. Something so ridiculous Bryn laughed until her stomach hurt, laughed until tears came, laughed for the first time in months. That night she slept better than she had since leaving foster care. Now Piper was still in the next room, separated by nothing but a thin wall, but Bryn felt the distance between them more than ever. Piper's eyes had been different these past few days, no longer clear and carefree, half worried, half afraid, half wanting to ask, half not daring to hear the answer. The cord between them, the only cord Bryn had chosen with her own hands, was stretching tight, and she didn't know how to keep it from snapping. Bryn hugged her knees, and her right hand drifted again to the scar, fingers tracing the raised, uneven line on her left arm, an old habit that surfaced whenever she felt the world sliding out of reach. Cold rain seeped through the iron railing and into her bare feet, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the cold curling in her chest. She missed her mother, not in pictures, because the image of her mother had blurred with time, her face in Bryn's memory now only a soft outline, a smile, a head of hair, a thin hand. She missed her by voice, her mother's voice at the end, hoarse and weak, but every word carved as clearly as stone. "Be brave, my girl. Be brave for me." Rain ran down Bryn's face, and she didn't know when her tears began to blend with it. She didn't cry out loud. Bryn Holloway hadn't cried out loud since she was 8. The tears simply fell, silent, mixed with rain, slid down the rusted railing, and disappeared into the Chicago night as if they'd never existed. As if her pain were the same, small and invisible, unseen and unknown, flowing away in silence in the middle of a city of 10 million people. The rain kept falling outside the balcony, and memory pulled Bryn under the way an undertow had pulled beneath Lake Michigan that morning. It didn't ask. It didn't wait for permission. It only pulled. She was 8 years old. A small hospital room with a low ceiling, fluorescent lights flickering with a faint buzzing sound Bryn would never forget, because it became the soundtrack to the worst day of her life. The sharp sting of disinfectant burned her nose, mixed with something sweet and nauseating. A smell she would later learn in nursing school was the smell of a body shutting down. Her mother lay in the bed, smaller than Bryn remembered, much smaller, as if the illness had eaten her from the inside out, chewing away bit by bit until there was only bone and skin and eyes. Her mother's eyes were still open, still bright, still fixed on Bryn with a love Bryn would spend the rest of her life searching for in every place she looked, and never find again. Her mother's hand held Bryn's hand, so thin Bryn could feel each knuckle beneath the skin. And that hand was cold. Colder than a living hand should be. But it still squeezed, still held on, still refused to let go. "Be brave, my girl. Be brave for me." Her mother's voice was hoarse, each word a breath, each breath a massive effort. And Bryn nodded hard, nodded as if nodding hard enough could keep her mother from leaving. Then the heart monitor, the machine Bryn had listened to beeping steadily for so many weeks it had become a second heartbeat to her, suddenly let out one long, flat, continuous sound, unbroken. Her mother's hand loosened. Bryn sat there, 8 years old, watching nurses rush in, watching them do things she didn't understand, watching them stop, watching one person shake their head, and she couldn't understand why her mother wouldn't open her eyes again. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, because she didn't understand. What did death mean when you were 8? What did my mother is never coming back mean when you were 8? She just sat there, still holding her mother's hand as it cooled, and waited. Waited for her mother to open her eyes, and waited. After her mother came her father. Not that her father died, but worse. Her father stayed alive and turned into someone else. Alcohol swallowed him day by day, bottle by bottle, night after night passed out on the sofa, morning after morning with bloodshot eyes and breath heavy with the smell. Bryn was 12. That night her father came home late, drunk, slammed into the kitchen table, and the bottle fell and shattered on the floor, glass exploding across the small kitchen like a bomb. Bryn ran out because she thought he might be hurt, and that was her mistake. Her father whipped around, eyes red and cloudy, not recognizing his daughter, or recognizing her and not caring, and his arm snapped out, fast and hard, striking Bryn's left arm. Not a fist, the side of his hand, but he still had the neck of the broken bottle in his grip, and a shard of glass sliced a long line into her arm, from her elbow almost down to her wrist, blood running hot and fast along her skin. Bryn didn't scream. She'd learned long ago that screaming only made him worse. She pressed a kitchen towel to the wound, sat in the bathroom, washed it herself, wrapped it herself, and cried alone in the dark. That scar healed, but it didn't disappear. It stayed there, long, paler than the surrounding skin, slightly raised, and from that night on, violence became the only language in the house, a language her father spoke fluently, and Bryn learned to read with pure survival instinct. She learned to hear his footsteps on the stairs, and know whether tonight would be safe just by the rhythm of his steps. She learned to make herself as small as possible, as quiet as possible, as invisible as possible. 4 years. 4 years living like that, until a December night when Bryn was 16. Snow fell thick beyond the window. Chicago washed white, and Bryn had just finished a dishwashing shift at a small Italian restaurant 4 blocks from home. She walked back through the snow, hands reddened by dishwater and cold wind, tired, but with $20 in tips stuffed into her coat pocket, enough to buy food for 2 days. She opened the front door and knew immediately. Not because she saw something, because she didn't. The house was empty. Not empty because her father was out. Empty in a different way. A way Bryn felt in her skin before her eyes could confirm it. Her father's shoes weren't on the rack. His coat wasn't on the hook. His bedroom drawers were pulled open, bare. On the kitchen table there was only one thing left. An empty liquor bottle, tipped on its side, the cap off, the last drops dried into a brown streak on the wood. No letter, no note, no apology. He didn't say goodbye because Bryn wasn't worth saying goodbye to. She stood in the living room, 16 years old, snow falling white outside the window, the heat off because her father hadn't paid the bill, and the cold flooded the empty house like water flooding a sinking ship, cold rising from the floor into her feet, from the walls into her bones, from the air into her lungs. It was the most primitive cold Bryn had ever known, not the cold of weather, but the cold of standing in the middle of the world and realizing that not a single person, not one person, on the entire planet. I was thinking about her. No one came looking. No one called. The phone stayed silent. The doorbell never rang. She stood there, alone, in an empty house in the middle of a snowy night, and for the first time she understood the true meaning of orphan, not losing a mother and father, but having no one left to lose. The foster care system picked Bryn up 2 weeks after that snowy night, when neighbors called the police because the lights in the house hadn't been turned on for days. A social worker arrived, a woman with short hair and tired eyes, holding a thick folder, looking at Bryn with the expression she would see over and over again for the next 2 years, pity mixed with helplessness. She was placed with her first family within 48 hours, a couple in the southern suburbs of Chicago, a clean house, a dog, a white fence, and Bryn thought maybe this would be all right. 3 months later, they sent her back because the wife was pregnant and there wasn't enough room. No one asked Bryn if she wanted to stay. No one explained. One morning, she woke up and the social worker was standing at the door with the same familiar folder. The second family was worse. The foster mother was a large woman living in a 3-bedroom house in Englewood, taking in 4 children at once, and Bryn quickly understood that she fostered not out of love, but for the state check that arrived every month. She called Bryn bastard, not behind her back but to her face, in a normal tone as if it were her name. Give the bowl to the bastard. Tell the bastard to clean the bathroom. Bryn didn't react, didn't cry, didn't argue. She had learned silence during 4 years with her father, and that skill, the skill of making herself invisible, became her only survival tool in a system where children were merchandise moved from one shelf to another. 6 months there, then she was transferred again. The third family, on the west side, looked better on paper. A young couple, a decent house, and a biological son named Derek, who was 17. The first week was calm. The second week, Bryn discovered the money she'd hidden under her pillow was gone. $43. Savings from the months before her father disappeared. Money she treated like a talisman because it was the only thing she owned in the world. Derek looked at her and smiled. A smile that knew she couldn't do anything. knew she wouldn't speak because who would believe a foster kid over a biological son? And Bryn looked back, didn't smile, didn't cry, only remembered. Remembered that this world takes everything if you don't hold tight. And even when you hold tight, it still finds a way to take. The fourth family was better. A retired teacher living alone in Rogers Park. A small but clean home that always smelled of baked goods and hot tea. She didn't yell, didn't scold, didn't call Bryn anything but her name. She left Bryn alone when she wanted space, asked if she was hungry when it was time to eat, and never touched her without asking first. It was the first time in 2 years Bryn slept 8 straight hours without jolting awake in the middle of the night. But she didn't trust the woman. Not because she was bad, because Bryn had learned, through 4 families in 2 years, that everything good had an expiration date, that every roof was temporary, that every offered hand could be withdrawn, and that the only way not to hurt when abandoned was never to cling to anything in the first place. At 18, Bryn aged out of the system. No farewell party, no gifts, just a file, a backpack holding everything she owned in the world, and a door opening onto real life with the unspoken message, take care of yourself. She did. 3 jobs at once, waiting tables at an Italian restaurant by day, washing dishes at a fast food place by night, cleaning a hospital on weekends. 4 hours of sleep, sometimes 3. She ate whatever was cheapest. Instant noodles, bread, leftovers, the kitchen manager let her take home. Her hands cracked from dishwater. Her back ached from hospital floors. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But every morning she got up. Every morning, when the alarm rang at 4:30, Bryn opened her eyes, put her feet on the cold floor, and stood. Not because she wanted to, because no one else would stand up for her. 5 years like that. 5 years of instant noodles, dishwater, hospital floors, and 4 hours of sleep. Then one day, when Bryn was 23, she opened the mailbox in front of the rundown building she rented at the time and found a thin white envelope with a university logo. She stood on the sidewalk, opened it, read the first line, then read it again, then again, because her vision blurred and the words swam, and she wasn't sure she was reading it right. We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Bachelor of Nursing program. Bryn sat down right there on the sidewalk, back against the mailbox post, letter in her hands, and cried. Cried from happiness. For the first time in her life, her tears weren't for loss, weren't for pain, weren't for fear. They were because someone, somewhere, had looked at her file and said, good enough. She was good enough. The rain had stopped by the time Bryn returned to the present. She stood in the bathroom mirror, yellow light washing over her wet face, swollen eyes, tangled hair. She looked at herself. The scar on her left arm, long, pale, raised under the light, the dark circles beneath her eyes from nights without enough sleep, the thin lines of her face, cheekbones sharp, the marks of years without enough food. But her eyes, Bryn looked into her own eyes in the mirror and saw they were still there, bright, hard, refusing to go out. The eyes that watched her mother close her own and didn't break, that watched her father walk away and didn't break, that watched 4 foster families close their doors and didn't break, that watched 5 years of instant noodles and 4 hours of sleep and didn't break. Foster care didn't kill her, poverty didn't kill her, her biological father abandoned her, and she was still standing here. 27 years old, nearly a nurse, alive on nothing but her own 2 hands and a stubbornness her mother had called courage. Kane Moretti, with eyes colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan, and the words, whether you want it or not, wouldn't kill her either. Bryn began visiting Catherine every Tuesday and Friday, not because Kane asked her to, not because of any debt, but for a reason simpler and more frightening than all the others. She wanted to go. Catherine Moretti, the old woman she had pulled from Blackwater, the woman with eyes sharp as blades and hands warm as a furnace, had become something Bryn didn't dare name but felt clearly every time she sat beside her bed, the closest thing to motherhood she had touched since the heart monitor went flat in a hospital room when she was 8 years old. They talked for hours. Catherine asked about school, about the patients Bryn met during clinicals, about emergency cases Bryn described with a rare, animated intensity, and Catherine listened with a fullness of attention Bryn had never received from anyone before, the kind of attention that made every word feel worth speaking, worth hearing. In return, Catherine told stories. Not many, not in order. They came as fragments slipping out in the middle of other conversations, as if the past were something she didn't intentionally summon, but that surfaced anyway. like bones exposed after erosion strips the soil away. One Friday afternoon, when sunlight slanted through the hospital window and laid a long golden stripe across the floor, Catherine was talking about a garden she once kept at her old house when she stopped mid-sentence, eyes drifting toward the window, and her voice changed, softer, heavier, as if words now had to carry the weight of an entire lifetime. Enzo planted a lemon tree in the corner of the yard, she said, almost whispering. My husband, he said Italian lemons had to be planted where the sun was strongest. Silence followed. Bryn didn't ask anything. She had learned that with Catherine, silence wasn't a gap to be filled, but a space where truth could find its own way out. Enzo was shot in front of our house, Catherine said, still looking out the window. Kane was 14. He was standing right there. He saw everything. Bryn's chest tightened. She pictured a 14-year-old boy standing at his front door, watching his father fall, blood on the sidewalk, and she didn't need Catherine to say more to understand that the boy had died with his father that day, died in a way the world never saw, and that what stood up afterward, what wore black suits and said whether you wanted or not, in a voice without feeling, was someone else entirely. Catherine went on, her tone steady, slow, like a prayer. Marco, Kane's brother, 3 years older. Kinder, softer. The one Catherine believed would lead the family out of the darkness. But Frank Salerno thought otherwise. Marco was killed when Kane was 22. 1 bullet, clean and professional. And Kane, the child who had lost his father at 14, lost his brother at 22, becoming the last man standing between the Moretti family and extinction. He became a man the day his father's blood hit the pavement, Catherine said, turning back to Bryn, her eyes bright and grieving at the same time. But he lost his soul the day Marco fell. Bryn sat without moving, fingers clenched around the edge of the chair, and felt something shift inside her chest, a structural plate sliding slightly out of alignment, subtle but permanent. She had lost her mother at 8. Kane had lost his father at 14. She had been abandoned by her father. Kane had lost his brother. She built walls from silence and 4 hours of sleep a night. Kane built walls from black suits, bodyguards, and a voice stripped of emotion. Different walls, built from the same material, the fear of losing more. That afternoon, when Bryn left Catherine's room, Catherine was asleep, breathing evenly, hands resting on the white blanket, and Bryn closed the door softly and stepped into the quiet hallway smelling of disinfectant and fresh flowers. Kane was there. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, leaning against the opposite wall, arms at his sides, eyes lowered to the floor. When she stepped out, he looked up, and Bryn noticed something in his eyes she had never seen before. A weariness. Not physical fatigue, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long, alone. My mother's been happier since you started visiting, he said, his voice light, sincere, and Bryn almost stepped back, because it was the first time she had heard Kane Moretti speak without command, layered into his words, without power pressing down on every syllable. There were only 2 words, thank you, plain, real, and because they were real, they weighed more than any lavish promise he had ever made. She stopped. He looked at her. The hallway hummed softly under fluorescent lights, the faint scent of lilies drifting from a nearby vase, and amid all those lifeless things, amid hospitals and black suits and debts and escalades, Bryn looked into Kane's eyes and saw what Catherine had shown her with words. The 14-year-old boy standing at his front door, his father's blood on the sidewalk, the soul lost the day his brother fell. Beneath the steel, beneath eyes colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan, Kane Moretti carried a wound, and that wound, Bryn realized with quiet terror, looked exactly like her own. The same shape, the same depth, the same way of healing by never truly healing at all, sealing over on the surface while still bleeding inside. Silence stretched for 3 breaths, then 4, then 5. No one spoke. No one needed to. Then Bryn turned and walked quickly down the hallway, her shoes striking the stone floor, echoing in the empty space. And she didn't look back, because she was afraid. Not of Kane, not of the Mafia, not of Salerno or Black Roses or any threat he had named. She was afraid of herself. Afraid of the way her heart had beaten faster when she saw the crack in his armor. Afraid of the way she wanted to stop, to say something, to touch that wound as if touching her own. Cold Chicago wind struck her face when she pushed through the hospital doors and stepped outside. But the warmth from Kane's eyes followed her, persistent, unwilling to let go. Warmer than this winter was cold. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. On Tuesday morning, Bryn stepped out of her apartment building with her bag on her shoulder, her mind still caught on Kane's look in the hospital hallway the afternoon before, and she was trying to push that image away when her eyes landed on Briggs. He stood beside the Escalade as he did every morning, but today something was different. Briggs wasn't looking at her. He was looking at her battered old Honda Civic, parked a few meters away, and on the face that was usually as flat as Lake Michigan on a windless day, Bryn saw a crack for the first time. Not fear. Briggs didn't fear. She doubted he even knew how. It was something worse. Recognition. The kind of recognition a soldier has when he spots a tripwire. Bryn followed Briggs's gaze and saw it. On the Honda's windshield, tucked under the driver's side wiper, there was a rose, black, the stem cut clean and precise, as if it had been cut with a surgical blade instead of scissors. The petals were a pure, unnatural black. Black in a way Bryn didn't want to think about, and morning dew beaded on the petals like tears made of glass. It was beautiful. Beautiful the way a venomous snake is beautiful. The way a scalpel is beautiful under surgical lights. Beautiful and lethal and not meant to be touched. Before Bryn could take another step, Briggs moved in front of her, lifting one hand, palm toward her, a decisive gesture. Stop. He pulled out his phone, made a call, and Bryn heard his voice carry a tone she had never heard from him before, something other than flatness. We've got a message. Southwest entrance. Her car. 10 minutes. That was all it took for the world around Bryn to turn into a war zone. 2 more Escalades appeared from opposite directions and stopped hard, and men in black suits poured out like water. Fast, silent, efficient. 2 of them searched the Honda. 1 slid under the car with a flashlight. 1 popped the hood. 1 ran some kind of device along the frame. Bryn stood on the sidewalk with her bag still on her shoulder, watching the rusted car she'd driven for 4 years get taken apart like a crime scene. Because it was a crime scene. Someone had come here in the night, slipped past Briggs or used the moment he changed shifts, placed a black rose on her car, and disappeared. Someone knew where she lived, knew what she drove, knew how to approach without being seen. Bryn's phone vibrated. Kane. She answered, and for the first time his voice wasn't flat. It was still low, still controlled, but beneath that control there was something boiling. Something Bryn recognized with the instinct of someone trained to read emotion beneath a surface. Anger, and beneath the anger, fear. Did you touch anything? Kane asked, quick and clipped. No, Bryn said. Briggs saw it before I did. Good. A brief silence. Stay where you are. Don't go anywhere. Then Bryn asked, and her voice was calm in a way that surprised her, calmer than she felt. What does that rose mean? A long silence. Longer than any silence in any call before this one. Bryn could hear Kane breathing, slow and heavy, like a man holding something enormous in his chest. Then he said, It means Frank Salerno knows who you are. The name dropped into the call like a stone into a well, and Bryn heard its echo spread outward, deep and cold and bottomless. Frank Salerno, the man who had ordered Catherine to be pushed into the lake, the man who had killed Marco, Kane's brother, the man Catherine called an enemy, the one Kane called a threat, the reason an army of men in black suits existed at all. Kane explained in short bursts, each sentence cut as cleanly as a bullet. The black rose was Salerno's signature. He left it before he struck. Not to frighten, to let the victim know he was coming, that he could reach them any time he wanted, and that when he decided to finish it, nothing would stop him. He's patient, Kane said, his voice dropping so low Bryn had to press the phone tight to her ear. He watches, he waits, and then he moves. The call ended, and the world around Bryn changed immediately. Security doubled. The Escalade no longer traveled alone. There was always another vehicle behind it, and Briggs no longer waited by the car, but stood directly outside Bryn's apartment door, eyes sweeping the hallway, and his hand, Bryn noticed for the first time, kept the left side of his suit jacket slightly parted, where she caught a glimpse of a dark leather strap belonging to something she didn't want to name. The pickup route changed every day, never taking the same streets twice, and Bryn realized with a cold clarity that this wasn't an overreaction. It was protocol. Protocol built for war. On the way to school that morning, Bryn sat in the back seat of the Escalade with Briggs driving, a new man in the passenger seat, and she stared at the black rose sealed inside an evidence bag on the seat beside her. Someone had lifted it from her car, placed it in plastic, labeled it, like evidence in a crime drama, and now it lay there, pure black beneath clear film, petals slightly wilted but still holding their shape, still beautiful, still deadly. Bryn looked at it and thought of Salerno, a man she had never met, never seen, who already knew where she lived, what she drove, and could get close enough to place this on her windshield in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. He knew her, and she knew nothing about him beyond his name, beyond the fact that he was patient, that he watched, and that he had killed Kane's brother, pushed Kane's mother into the lake, and now sent Bryn a black rose. Bryn's hands lay on her thighs, straight and still. They didn't shake. 27 years of survival had taught her how to keep her hands from trembling even when inside her. Everything was trembling. Everything. Piper saw everything. She'd been home that morning, standing on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching as 2 Escalades surged in, watching men in black suits spill out to search Bryn's Honda, watching Briggs step in front of Bryn with his arm like a steel barricade. Piper saw the evidence bag. She saw the new man in the passenger seat. The left side of his suit jacket slightly bulged. She saw Bryn's face as she climbed into the vehicle, a face Piper knew better than anyone, a face trying to stay calm while the eyes did not, the eyes telling the whole truth. When Bryn came home that evening, Piper was sitting on the sofa. No instant noodles, no television on, no crossed legs and laughter. Piper sat upright, hands on her thighs, brown eyes fixed on the door when Bryn walked in. And Bryn knew immediately, with the instinct sharpened by 19 years of reading body language to survive, that tonight would be different from every other night. "Tell me the truth, Bryn." Piper's voice wasn't angry. Worse than angry. It was tired, worn down, the kind of tired that comes from waiting too long and not having the strength to wait anymore. All of it. Everything. "Or I'm done here." Bryn set her bag on the floor, slowly, letting the words sink in. She looked at Piper, at those brown eyes. The eyes that had watched her laugh on an empty floor 3 years earlier as they ate instant noodles without a table. The eyes that had watched her cry exactly once on the night Bryn spoke about foster care. The only eyes in the world that looked at her and saw Bryn, not a bastard, not an orphan, not a case number. And Bryn wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to sit beside Piper, take her hand, and say everything. Tell her about the black water, about Catherine being pushed, about Kane Moretti and eyes colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan, about the word Mafia hanging between them over a white tablecloth, about Frank Salerno and the black rose on her windshield. But what could she say? "Listen, Piper. I saved a Mafia boss's mother from drowning, and now his enemy knows who I am and could kill me any time." And then what? Would Piper be safer knowing, or more endangered? If Salerno knew who Bryn was, he could know who Piper was too, and truth wouldn't protect Piper. Truth would turn Piper into another name on a list, another piece of leverage, another black rose on a windshield. Silence stretched. Bryn opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I can't," she said, her voice rough, each word scraping her throat like sand. "I'm sorry, Piper. I can't tell you." Piper stared at her. Her eyes reddened, not red from crying, not yet, but red from restraint, from holding something together that had been breaking for a long time and could no longer be held. "Then I can't keep doing this," Piper said, her voice shaking but every word clear, every word thought through, probably rehearsed in her head more than once before she spoke it aloud. "I can't sit here and watch you disappear. Watch you become someone I don't recognize. Watch men in black search your car at 6 in the morning and pretend everything is normal." Bryn said nothing. She couldn't say anything. Every word she knew was useless against that face, against those reddened eyes, against the simple truth that Piper was right. Completely right. Bryn was disappearing, becoming someone she didn't recognize either. And she was dragging Piper into a darkness she couldn't even describe the shape of. Piper stood up, went into her room, closed the door, and Bryn stood in the living room listening through the thin door to the sound of drawers opening, a closet shutting, clothes being folded, and she knew before the bedroom door opened again. Knew before she saw the small blue suitcase, the one they'd bought together at a garage sale last year for $5, and argued about who got to use first. Piper came out with the suitcase rolling behind her, and that sound, the small, ordinary sound of plastic wheels on old wood, in the silence of the apartment then, rang out like a bone breaking. Piper stopped at the door and looked back at Bryn. Her eyes were wet now, and Bryn could see Piper wanted to say something, wanted to hug her, wanted to stay, but couldn't, because staying meant accepting being shut out of the life of her best friend, and Piper loved Bryn too much to endure that. She was leaving because she cared, and that was the cruelest part. The door closed, footsteps on the stairs, fading farther and farther away. The main door downstairs slammed, then silence. Bryn stood in the apartment, and the apartment suddenly felt too large, too empty, too quiet. The sofa where they'd once eaten instant noodles together held only one indentation now. Piper's coffee mug was still on the kitchen table, half full, gone cold. Piper's room stood open, empty, only the bed made with white sheets and empty hangers in an open closet. Bryn looked down at her own hands, the hands that had pulled Catherine out of black water, the hands that had pressed on the old woman's chest, beat after beat, praying life would stay. Hands that saved people. But those hands couldn't hold on to Piper, couldn't hold on to normal life, couldn't hold on to the one thing Bryn had chosen with her own hands, built with her own hands, protected for 3 years. She sat down on the sofa, alone, in the apartment where the only sounds left were the heater's low hum and the smell of cold coffee. Night fell. Bryn didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and the apartment felt colder than it ever had. Not because the heat was broken, not because of Chicago winter, because for the first time in 3 years, there was no steady breathing coming from the next room, no Piper. And that cold, the cold of loss, of an empty room, of the most important person walking out the door, Bryn recognized it. She knew it. She had met it at 8 when her mother closed her eyes, at 16 when her father left. It always came back, and every time, it was colder than the last. Bryn didn't sleep that night. She lay on the sofa staring at the ceiling until the darkness thinned into gray, and the gray turned into the dull light of a Chicago winter morning slipping through the curtains. Piper's cold coffee mug was still on the kitchen table. Bryn didn't touch it, didn't wash it, as if washing it would mean admitting Piper was truly gone. At 6 in the morning, she got up, splashed her face with cold water, pulled on jeans and a coat, and walked out the door. Briggs stood in the hallway as he did every morning, gray eyes sweeping over her in a quick scan, checking, assessing, professional habit. "Take me to Kane's office," Bryn said, her voice flat. No explanation, no asking. Briggs looked at her for 2 seconds, then nodded. Kane's office building was a block of glass and steel in downtown Chicago, the kind of building Bryn had walked past 100 times without ever imagining she would step inside. The lobby was wide, ceilings high, polished granite floors reflecting the lights, and black suits everywhere, guarding, patrolling, speaking into earpieces, eyes scanning every corner. Briggs took her into an elevator, up to the top floor, and when the doors opened, Bryn stepped into a silent corridor lined with thick carpet. At the end stood double wooden doors. Briggs knocked twice, then opened them for her. Kane's office was as large as Bryn's entire apartment, maybe larger. 3 walls were glass, looking out over Chicago spread below. A gray sky, skyscrapers rising through the morning haze like fangs. Kane sat behind his desk, laptop open, the screen's glow lighting his face, and when Bryn walked in, he looked up. His eyes widened. Not much, just a fraction. But Bryn saw it, and it was the first time she had ever seen Kane Moretti genuinely surprised, caught in a moment he hadn't controlled, hadn't prepared for, hadn't predicted. The moment vanished in less than a second, replaced by his usual calm, but Bryn had seen it, and she filed it away. He pointed to the chair across from his desk. Bryn sat, spine straight, hands on her thighs, looking him in the eye. She hadn't come here to be polite. "The black rose on my car," Bryn said, her voice even. Each word weighed with an entire sleepless night. "My best friend just left because I can't tell her the truth. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. Let me go, Kane." Silence. Kane stared at her, eyes dark, unblinking, and Bryn held his gaze, refusing to look away, even while something inside her trembled. Then Kane spoke, and his voice changed. Not dramatically, not breaking, but with a small crack, just enough for Bryn to hear what lay beneath the steel. "Do you really think I want it like this?" Bryn blinked. She hadn't expected that. She had expected an order, cold logic, another version of whether you want it or not a question, and not a voice that trembled on the last syllable. Kane pushed the laptop aside, slowly, and placed both hands on the desk, fingers lacing together. You think I chose this life? He said, his voice lower, more restrained, but the crack was widening. My father was shot dead in front of our house when I was 14. I was standing there. I saw his blood on the sidewalk. I tried to press my hands over the wound, but the blood kept pouring through my fingers. And he looked at me, and I watched the light go out in his eyes. He stopped, breathed, controlled himself, then continued. My brother, Marco, was killed by Salerno when I was 22. One bullet. Marco was the best man I ever knew, and he killed Marco like he was swatting a fly. My mother is the last person I have. The silence turned heavy. Kane looked at Bryn, and she saw what she had glimpsed in the hospital hallway the afternoon before, but now clearer, deeper, more painful. The wound. Not a wound hidden beneath armor. The armor itself was the wound, forged from loss, from his father's blood on the sidewalk, from the bullet that took Marco, from 18 years of carrying an entire family on his shoulders, without being allowed to be weak for even a second. You saved the only person I have left, Kane said, and each word landed like stone. That debt isn't something I can calculate. It isn't something I can repay with money or cars or guards. You saved my mother, and I will protect you at any cost, not because you owe me, but because I owe you something I will never finish paying. Bryn sat there looking at him, and for the first time, she truly understood. Kane wasn't controlling her because of power. Not because he enjoyed ownership, not because she was an object or a puppet or a file on his desk. Kane controlled because he was afraid. Afraid of losing more. Afraid Salerno would take one more person. Afraid the emptiness his father and Marco left behind would widen, deepen, and swallow him whole. He was afraid, and fear was a language Bryn spoke more fluently than anyone. Silence stretched. Gray Chicago beyond the glass. Then Kane said, his voice returning to control, but thinner than before, more brittle than before. I can't let you go. Not while Salerno is watching, but I can give you more space, more freedom inside the protection I can provide. Bryn looked at him. And when does it end? When do I get real freedom? Kane held her eyes, and Bryn saw in the depth of his gaze a promise spoken not by his mouth but by the full weight of a man who had lost too much. When this is over, you will be free. No more ties. I promise. The last two words were softer than everything he'd said before, but Bryn felt them as the heaviest, because she knew, from 27 years of reading people and reading pain, that Kane Moretti wasn't a man who promised lightly. He promised because he believed it, and he believed it because he needed to. Needed to believe there would be a day when this ended, a day when he wouldn't have to build walls around everyone he cared about just to keep them alive. Bryn stood. She didn't say anything else. She walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway, didn't turn back, and said only one thing. I came here to demand my freedom. But what I saw was a man who is afraid, and I don't know whether that makes me feel better or worse. Then she left, and Kane watched her go in silence, alone in the vast office overlooking gray Chicago. And for the first time, he looked exactly like the thing he had spent 18 years trying to hide, a lonely man. In the weeks after the confrontation in Kane's office, the rhythm of Bryn's life changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not in a dramatic way, not with storms and explosions, but in small, gradual shifts, the kind that drips carve into stone, the kind that roots push through concrete, the kind where something soft slips into the hairline cracks of the wall she'd built for 19 years and quietly widens it, little by little. Kane kept his word. There was more space. Briggs was still there, but he kept a greater distance, waiting by the car instead of standing outside her door, and the route to and from places no longer changed every day, only twice a week. Kane still called, but less often, shorter calls, and his voice was softer, less command in it, more silence, the kind of silence Bryn was beginning to recognize wasn't because Kane didn't know what to say, but because he was weighing whether he should say it at all. Bryn continued visiting Catherine every Tuesday and Friday, and now she no longer had to convince herself it was an obligation. She came because Catherine told stories well, because she smiled with her eyes before she smiled with her mouth, because the way Catherine held her hand at every visit carried the certainty of someone who would never let go first, and because Kane was sometimes there. Not every time, not always in the hallway, but often enough that Bryn began to know when he was present and when he wasn't, by a sixth sense she hated to admit she was developing. And then the small moments began to accumulate. One Tuesday afternoon, Bryn sat in a chair outside Catherine's room, waiting while Catherine's bandages were changed, exhausted after a long clinical shift, eyes closed, head against the wall, and when she opened her eyes, there was a steaming paper cup on the small table beside her chair. Black coffee, no sugar. She looked down the hallway. No one, but the familiar trace of cologne, sandalwood, and something sharper, more metallic, still lingered in the air. And Bryn knew who had left it there. She had never told Kane what she drank, but he knew, the way he knew everything. And this time, instead of feeling invaded, Bryn felt something else, something warmer, smaller, more dangerous. She drank the coffee. It was good, exactly what she liked. And she hated that it was good. Hated that someone knew her well enough to choose the right thing she needed without asking, because it meant someone was paying attention to her, really paying attention, not in the way of surveillance or control, but in the way Bryn hadn't been held in anyone's attention since her mother died. Another Friday evening, Bryn left Catherine's room later than usual. The hallway was mostly empty, the lights had dropped into night mode, and she almost walked straight into Kane at the turn near the elevators. He was leaning against the wall, his phone still in his hand, and his face, the face Bryn had grown used to seeing covered in steel, was bare in a way she suspected he never let anyone see. He looked pale, not pale from illness, but pale from something inside him eating at him. His jaw was tight, but not tight with anger, tight with the effort of keeping something from spilling over. His right hand was clenched into a fist, knuckles white, and when he looked up and saw Bryn, she saw those eyes, darker than the bottom of Lake Michigan, and now they were wet, not crying. Kane Moretti didn't cry. She was sure of that, but wet, the wetness of someone swallowing something too large to swallow. "Are you all right?" Bryn asked, and the question slipped out before she could stop it. Natural as breathing, nurse instinct or human instinct, or something she didn't want to name. Kane looked at her, his eyes widened, as if that question, the simplest 3 words in the world, had struck him where no bullet ever could. He stared at her the way a man stares at something he doesn't believe is real, the way someone stares at light entering a room he's lived in for so long he's forgotten what light looks like. Then he turned away. Fast, clean, long strides down the hallway, and Bryn watched him go, watched his back, watched his broad shoulders rigid under the black suit, and watched his hand, his right hand still clenched, but trembling, only slightly, almost invisible. But Bryn saw it because she'd spent 4 years learning to read the bodies of patients, and Kane's body in that moment was telling her he was in pain, pain no doctor could treat. The following week, as Bryn sat beside Catherine's bed, Catherine suddenly squeezed her hand harder than usual and said, her voice light, her gaze sharp as a blade, "He has never let anyone see him weak, not ever, not since the day his father died. He built walls around himself so thick that even I, his mother, sometimes can't get in. But with you," Catherine said, eyes fixed on Bryn's, "he forgets to hide." Bryn eased her hand out of Catherine's, gently but decisively, and shifted the conversation to Catherine's rehabilitation plan, her tone professional, calm, perfect, but her heart was beating faster than normal, and her hand, the one resting on her thigh under the edge of the bed where Catherine couldn't see, was ice cold. She was afraid. Not of Kane, not of Salerno, not of black roses or Escalades or the Chicago underworld. She was afraid of herself, afraid of the way she'd drunk that black coffee and felt warm, afraid of the way she'd asked, "Are you all right?" without thinking, afraid of the way she'd seen Kane's hand tremble in a dark hallway and wanted to touch it, wanted to tell him he didn't have to hide from me. She was falling into his orbit. She knew it, day by day, cup by cup of black coffee, glance by wet glance in a midnight hallway, moment by silent moment waiting outside Catherine's room knowing he was somewhere in this building. The invisible cord pulled her closer, closer, and Bryn, who had learned not to hold on to anything since she was 16, could feel her fingers tightening around that cord without wanting to let go. The cold was melting, but what replaced it, the warmth, soft and trembling, spreading in her chest whenever she thought of Kane Moretti, Bryn knew, was more frightening than any winter. Bryn stepped out of the exam room at 3:17 in the afternoon, and it took a few seconds for the outside world to slide back into place. Light, sound, the February cold hit her face, and she stood on the steps of the Health Sciences building, looking down at the campus, washed in pale, golden afternoon sun, and she understood that she'd passed. She knew it the moment she set her pen down on the final question. She knew it with the intuition of someone who had lived with the words in pharmacology books for 4 years, knew that every answer was right, every dosage exact, every procedure matched. She'd passed. Bryn Holloway, orphaned at 8, the kid called bastard in foster care, the girl who slept 4 hours a night and washed dishes until her hands cracked, the woman who had plunged into a frozen Lake Michigan to save a stranger and lost her exam because of it. She'd passed. She was officially a nurse. Chicago afternoon sun slanted through bare trees, warm and gentle, the rare kind of winter sun people call borrowed, loaned. A sun that doesn't stay long, but when it appears it's so beautiful it hurts. The light fell across Bryn's face, and she smiled. For the first time since that early morning on the lake, since the cold stole her breath and her life veered onto a road she hadn't chosen, Bryn Holloway smiled. Not a polite smile, not a forced one, a real smile. A smile with her whole face, with the eyes that were still bright and refused to go out. A smile because she'd done it, because she'd kept the promise she'd made to herself, to the 8-year-old girl sitting by her mother's bed, to the 16-year-old girl standing in an empty house on a snowy night. She had gotten up, every morning. And today, getting up finally meant something. Briggs waited at the bottom of the steps beside the escalade, and when Bryn came down, she saw him look at her, look at the smile on her face. And the strangest thing happened. The corner of Briggs's mouth twitched upward. Not a smile. Briggs didn't smile, but the closest thing to one that stone face could manage. And Bryn almost laughed out loud because it was probably the biggest compliment she'd ever received from him. He opened the car door for her, and for the first time in all the times Bryn climbed into the black Escalade, the air inside didn't feel heavy. There were no hidden commands, no tightening cord, only cool leather, the clean scent of a new car, and afternoon sunlight filtering through tinted glass and laying a warm golden stripe across her hands. Bryn took out her phone, opened her messages, typed to Catherine. I passed. Sent. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Then her phone vibrated. I knew it, my girl. I knew you'd pass. Come celebrate with me tomorrow. Bryn laughed, a real laugh, out loud in the car, and Briggs didn't turn around, but she could have sworn she saw his shoulders loosen slightly in the rearview mirror. She leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes. Sunlight streamed through the glass, warm on her face, warm on her closed lids, warm on her hands resting on her thighs, the hands that had once pulled someone out of black water, that had once pressed a chest to bring life back, that had once gripped a chair when Catherine said I was pushed, that had trembled when the black rose lay on her windshield. Those hands were quiet now, warm, and Bryn thought, maybe everything would be all right. Maybe she'd find a way out. A way to live beside the darkness and still keep her light. A way to move through Kane Moretti's world and still remain herself. Maybe. 5 minutes. Bryn had 5 minutes of pure happiness, unblended, unconditional. 5 minutes where she was a nurse, the woman who passed the exam, the girl Catherine called my girl, the person who made Briggs almost smile. Bryn Holloway and only Bryn Holloway. Not a puppet, not leverage, not a debt. 5 minutes of warm sun on her face, a smile on her mouth, and a future open as the Chicago sky beyond the tinted window. Then Briggs turned into a quiet intersection in the Southern Industrial District, where abandoned warehouses lined both sides of the road like rotten teeth, where the afternoon sun couldn't reach because tall buildings blocked it, and darkness fell over the Escalade like a hand closing over a candle. And everything stopped. 2 black trucks burst out of the alleys on either side of the road at the exact same moment, synchronized and precise, like the jaws of a bear trap snapping shut. Bryn hadn't even opened her eyes yet, hadn't even understood why the sunlight vanished, when the gunfire started. Not one shot. A burst, rapid and relentless, deafening. And the Escalade's windshield exploded, a rain of glass pouring down over her, tiny shards sharp as needles pricking her hands, her neck, her hair. The world became chaos in less than a second. Bryn hadn't even found her scream before Briggs moved, faster than anything she'd ever seen a human body move. His left hand yanked the wheel hard to the right. His right arm shot across the center console, grabbed Bryn by the shoulder, and drove her down to the floor with the force of a man who had practiced this motion 1,000 times. Her body hit the floor, pain flaring, but the bullets kept cracking overhead, and she heard Briggs draw his gun, heard shots from inside the vehicle, return fire, even louder than the rounds outside because it was close. Right above her, every blast vibrating in her skull. Bryn curled on the floor with both arms over her head, the stinging bite of gunpowder filling her nose, the smell of burning rubber, the smell of shattered glass, and through it all, Briggs's voice, not speaking but roaring, a raw sound of a man fighting to keep his life, fighting to keep hers. Another volley from outside, metal tearing through metal, the body of the Escalade shuddering, and Briggs snarled, a different sound, sharper, more pained. And Bryn heard his breathing turn heavy, heard the vehicle fishtail left, then right, tires screaming on the pavement, then the loss of control. Impact. Momentum flung Bryn into the door. Her head struck the metal bar of the front seat, a white flash detonating behind her eyes, then black. Silence. She didn't know how long. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. Bryn opened her eyes and the first thing she saw was smoke. White smoke rolled from the front of the vehicle, curling through the empty frame where the windshield had been, carrying the stench of melting plastic and hot metal. The Escalade was crushed, the front end folded into a light pole, the pole tilting overhead, everything dusted with glittering glass under what was left of the afternoon light. Bryn's head throbbed, her ears rang, blood coated her tongue where she'd bitten her lip while she was out. She dragged herself up from the floor, every part of her aching, and looked at the driver's seat. Briggs was slumped over the steering wheel, eyes closed, and blood. Blood soaking through his white shirt from his left shoulder, spreading fast, dark red, wet, more with every second. Bryn saw the blood and everything else disappeared. The ringing in her ears vanished. The pain in her head vanished. Fear vanished. What replaced it was something she knew better than her own name, the thing that had pulled her into Lake Michigan at dawn. The thing that had kept her hands pumping on Catherine's chest on wet grass, beat after beat. The instinct to save. She climbed over the center seat, her hands sliding over glass smeared with blood, and reached for Briggs's neck, 2 fingers to his carotid. A pulse, weak, fast, chaotic. The pulse of someone losing blood but not fully in shock yet. She eased him back from the wheel, carefully, supporting his head, and looked at the wound. Left shoulder. Blood coming from a small, clean hole, the bullet passing through front to back. No fragments lodged. And most important, the blood was dark rather than bright, flowing steady rather than spurting in rhythm, meaning it hadn't hit an artery. Briggs would live if she stopped the bleeding in time. Bryn tore her coat without hesitation, tore the shirt beneath it too, rolled the fabric into a thick compress, and pressed hard against the wound. Her hands were drenched in Briggs's blood, dark and hot and sticky, running through her fingers, and she pressed harder, using the full weight of her body, the same way she had pressed Catherine's chest by the lake, the same prayerful rhythm, beat after beat, holding life in place with bare hands. Saving Catherine with CPR on wet grass. Saving Briggs with a pressure dressing inside a crushed car. 2 times. 2 lives. The same hands. Her hands didn't shake. 27 years of surviving, 4 years of school, hundreds of clinical cases. Everything led here, to this moment, to blood-wet hands holding a life in the middle of twisted metal and spent shells. She was born to save people. That was the thing the lake couldn't take. Kane Moretti couldn't control. Salerno couldn't kill. Foster care and poverty and abandonment couldn't ever touch. That was her. That was Bryn Holloway. And no one could take it. Through the shattered glass and the stink of gunpowder, Bryn saw a small red light blinking on the broken dashboard, and understood that Briggs had hit the alarm before he collapsed. He'd made it, even with a bullet through his shoulder, even with blood pouring and the vehicle skidding, even in the final second before blacking out. Briggs had done his job, protecting her. The signal was already out, and someone was on the way. Bryn pressed harder against Briggs's wound, eyes fixed on the empty road through the ruined windshield frame, ears straining through the ringing and the hiss of smoke, and waited. The afternoon sun was completely gone now. The southern industrial district lay dark and cold, the smell of gunpowder mixing with hot metal and blood, and Bryn knelt in the wreckage with her hands slick with blood, her clothes torn, and the cold, the violent cold, real cold, not metaphor, not emotion, but the cold of steel and bullets and shattered glass and human blood, flooded into the crushed vehicle like water flooding a sinking ship. The underworld had shown its teeth, and Bryn's 5 minutes of happiness were over, forever. The sound of tires tearing across pavement came before the engine. Bryn heard it through the ringing in her ears, through the hiss of smoke from the crushed front end, through Briggs's ragged breathing beneath her hands, and she knew, by an instinct she couldn't explain, that it wasn't the enemy coming back. The enemy didn't arrive with that sound, the sound of desperate speed, of someone racing in because they were terrified of being too late. 2 black Escalades scraped the curb, brakes screaming, and the doors flew open before the wheels had fully stopped turning. Men in black suits poured out with guns in their hands, eyes sweeping the industrial block with organized ferocity. But Bryn didn't look at them. She looked at the man stepping out of the second vehicle, Kane, and she didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different. Same black suit, same sharp face, same tall, powerful frame. But what lived inside him, what Bryn had learned to see hidden beneath a perfect shell of control, wasn't hidden now. It was burning. Kane stepped out of the car, and for the first time since Bryn had known him, he lost control. No flat voice, no silent footsteps, no eyes colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan. What Bryn saw was fire, pure, primal, violent. His jaw was clenched so hard tendons stood out along his throat. Every muscle in his face was tight. His whole body shook, not with fear, but with rage so large his body could barely contain it. He looked at the Escalade crushed around the light pole, at the glass scattered across the road, at the shell casings rolling in the grit, and he roared her name. Bryn. That sound wasn't Kane's voice. It was the roar of an animal, ripping through air thick with gunpowder, and Bryn, kneeling in wreckage with Briggs's blood on her hands, felt it vibrate in her chest harder than the gunfire had. Kane ran to the crushed vehicle. Actually ran. Not a fast walk or a rushed stride, but a run, leaving the men in black suits behind, leaving every security rule he had surely built and followed for 10 years as the head of his family. And when he reached the torn open frame of the door, when his eyes found Bryn sitting there, hair wild, face bruised, glass glittering on her shoulders, both hands soaked red as she pressed on Briggs's shoulder, he stopped. Froze. 1 second. His gaze swept her from head to toe, fast and frantic, searching for wounds, searching for her blood, not Briggs's. And Bryn saw it in those eyes, the eyes she had seen hard as steel, wet in a midnight hallway, worn out behind a laptop. She saw something she had never seen there before. Fear. Not fear of Salerno, not fear of war, fear of losing her. And Bryn knew, with 4 years of reading bodies and 27 years of reading people to survive, that this wasn't fear of losing the woman who saved his mother. It wasn't fear of losing a debt, it was fear of losing her. Bryn. A person. The girl who drank black coffee without sugar. The girl who asked, "Are you all right?" in a dark hallway. The girl with a scar on her left arm and eyes that refused to go out. He was afraid of losing her. "I'm fine," Bryn said, her voice so steady it startled even her. "Briggs needs a hospital. Right now." Each word clear, professional, nurse voice, the voice she'd trained for 4 years for moments exactly like this, when chaos surrounds you, and the only thing keeping everything from collapsing is the calm of the one doing the saving. Kane held her gaze for 1 beat, just one, as if he needed a second more to believe she was really there, really alive, really fine. Then he moved. He stepped through the broken frame, bent down, slid both arms under Briggs's back and knees, and lifted. Bryn watched Kane carry Briggs out of the wreck, a man who weighed close to 100 kilos in his arms, and she was shocked by the gentleness. Kane was boiling, his body still trembling with rage, tendons still tight in his neck, jaw still locked, but the way he laid Briggs down, the way he supported the guard's head so it wouldn't jolt, was so careful it was almost tender. It was the care of a man used to loss, used to seeing people he loved fall, and who had learned, through blood and grief, that every life around him was worth more than gold. One of the men in black suits ran up with a first aid bag, and Kane snapped a short order in Italian, fast and sharp, then turned back to Bryn. She was trying to climb out of the vehicle, her legs shaking as adrenaline drained away, and Kane was there, his hand closing around her arm, steadying her, his hand on her arm, the first time they touched, not through invisible cords, not through calls or coffee or a look in a hallway. Real touch, skin on skin, and his hand was hot, hotter than Bryn expected, firm, strong, long fingers closing around her arm with just enough force to hold her, not enough to hurt, and trembling. Trembling in the way of a man who never let anyone see him weak. Trembling because he had just almost lost something he didn't know he needed, until it was almost taken. Bryn stood there with his hand on her arm, Briggs's blood still wet on her fingers, gunpowder in her hair, glass in her clothes, and she looked up into Kane's eyes, closer than ever, and she saw the fire still burning. But behind the fire, deeper than the fire, was what she had glimpsed in the hospital hallway, what Catherine called a wound, what Bryn called a mirror. He was like her. "Who did this?" Bryn asked, her voice low. And she didn't know why she asked, because she already knew the answer. Kane looked at her, eyes dark, fire and pain and rage boiling behind his clenched jaw, and said, "Salerno," and he just signed his own death sentence. His voice went cold again when he said it, but his hand on her arm stayed hot, still trembling, and Bryn understood that the cold in Kane's voice wasn't the old cold, the cold of control, the cold of distance. This was the cold of a blade just drawn from its sheath, cold meant to kill. Kane's safe house sat atop a building in River North, the highest floor, a penthouse with glass walls on 3 sides looking out over Chicago, which lay blanketed white under the night's snowfall. Bryn was brought there right after the ambulance took Briggs away, and she sat on a leather sofa wide enough to equal the entire living room of her old apartment, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, staring at snowflakes drifting past the glass without truly seeing them. Seeing only Briggs's eyes squeezed shut and the blood on her hands. Kane was on the phone in the next room, voice low and fast, Italian braided through English as he gave orders, arranged, deployed, and Bryn heard it without hearing it, her mind still trapped inside the crushed Escalade, still counting Briggs's pulse beneath her fingertips. Then her phone buzzed. Catherine. Her voice trembled, the first time Bryn had ever heard Catherine's voice tremble. "Are you hurt, my girl?" Bryn said she was fine, and her voice broke on the last word, broke in a way she hadn't allowed herself to break in front of anyone since she was 8. But Catherine wasn't just anyone. Catherine was the only warm hand Bryn had ever known, and she let herself be weak for exactly 3 seconds before she drew in a deep breath and said she really was fine. Catherine told her to rest, told her to sleep, told her to remember that she was here, always here, and Bryn ended the call, fist tight around her phone, eyes burning but refusing to cry. Briggs made it through the danger. The news came close to midnight, delivered by a man in a black suit, Bryn didn't know by name, who said it plainly. The bullet had been removed. There'd been heavy blood loss, but because bleeding had been controlled in time at the scene, there would be no permanent damage. Bryn closed her eyes, let her breath go, and felt the weight of a mountain slide off her shoulders. She saved Briggs, the way she saved Catherine, twice, 2 lives, with the same hands. After that, the penthouse went quiet. The men in black suits withdrew, and only the wind beyond the glass remained, and the thin sound of snow tapping the window like light knuckles. Bryn sat by the window, looking out at Chicago turned white, and heard footsteps. Kane came in. No suit, no bodyguards. A black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, collar open, his hair slightly messy. Not messily styled, but messy because he'd run his hand through it too many times. And Bryn looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time saw Kane Moretti as he might have been in another life, like an ordinary man. Not a boss, not a steel wall, just a tired man in the middle of a vast room, staring out at falling snow, with eyes carrying the weight of 18 years of shouldering everything, and 1 night of nearly losing more. He stopped a few steps away, not coming closer, facing the glass. "I never wanted this to happen to you," he said, voice low, and Bryn heard every word in the stillness. "I know," she said. Silence. Snow fell beyond the window, each flake caught by the city lights into a tiny gold point before vanishing into dark. "I should have protected you better," Kane said, his voice dropping nearly to a whisper, and Bryn heard something she'd never heard in him before. Something cracked, not shattered, but cracked like a hairline fracture in a dam, small and deep, with water seeping through, unstoppable. "You already did," Bryn said, turning to him. "Briggs almost died because of me. And you came." Kane looked at her, eyes dark, and spoke in a tone Bryn understood. Wasn't a promise, because promises could be thin, could be said to fill the air. But this was truth, simple as sunrise. "I'll always come." Silence. Bryn looked at him. He looked at her, and between them were a few steps, and falling snow, and his 18 years of steel walls, and her 19 years of silent walls, and blood on the pavement, and blood on the steering wheel, and 2 children who'd lost their parents and grown into adults who knew how to hide wounds, but didn't know how to heal. "Why do you care?" Bryn asked, her voice soft, each word measured with all the courage she had left. "Not because of the debt. Why?" Kane held her gaze for a long time, longer than he ever had. And the final layer of armor, the layer Catherine said even she couldn't reach, dropped away. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply fell, like the snow beyond the glass, light and silent, and underneath was a 14-year-old boy, kneeling on a sidewalk, hands trying to seal his father's wound, blood running through his fingers, and knowing he couldn't save him, he stepped closer. One step, only one, close enough for Bryn to feel the heat of his body, the familiar sandalwood, and something deeper, something no fragrance could create, the scent of a man standing on the thinnest edge between restraint and letting go. He didn't touch her. He didn't take her hand, didn't pull her into an embrace, didn't do anything that movies or books claim people should do. He simply stood there, close, close enough. And Bryn felt that warmth reach her without his hands, and it was warmer than anything she'd ever known. "I'm tired," Bryn said, almost a whisper. "Tired of running. From foster care, from poverty, from the people who were supposed to love me. I'm tired, Kane." Kane promised she'd be free when everything was over. No strings. Bryn looked at him. "What about you? Do you get to be free?" Kane didn't answer, but his eyes, the eyes Bryn had once thought colder than the bottom of Lake Michigan, the eyes that had burned like fire amid twisted metal, the eyes that had gone wet in a midnight hallway, those eyes looked at her and said everything his mouth didn't say, couldn't say, wasn't allowed to say. Morning. Bryn woke on the sofa, the blanket still around her, early sunlight slipping through the glass and laying pale gold across the floor. Chicago beyond was pure white under the sun, last night's snow covering everything, erasing every stain, erasing every trace of blood, and the city looked new, clean, like a promise. Footsteps. Kane stood a few steps away, holding 2 cups of coffee, still in the same black shirt from the night before, shadows under his eyes, and Bryn wondered if he'd slept at all, or if he'd stayed awake the entire night. He offered her 1 cup. His hand brushed hers as she took it. And this touch, this time, was different from the way he'd gripped her arm amid the wreckage. That touch had been violence, urgency, instinct. This one was choice. His fingers met hers along the warm paper rim, light, slow, and neither of them pulled away. Black coffee, no sugar. Bryn took a sip, hot, bitter, exactly how she liked it, and looked out at snowlit Chicago in the early sun. She thought of Lake Michigan frozen in the morning, of the cold that stole breath, of her hands hauling Catherine up from black water. She thought of the black rose, of Piper dragging a suitcase across a wooden floor, of her mother telling her to be brave, of her father leaving on a snowy night, of 4 foster families, and 9 years of instant noodles. She thought of Briggs covering her with his body, of Catherine holding her hand and calling her daughter, of Kane, eyes slowly warming from ice, hands trembling in a midnight corridor, the words "I'll always come" spoken like an unarguable fact. Salerno was still out there. The war wasn't over. The future was still blurred. But Bryn Holloway, for the first time in 27 years, wasn't facing the dark alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The cold brought her here. But warmth, unexpected, frightening, impossible to deny, was what made her stay. Bryn's story reminds us that sometimes kindness isn't free. It has a cost. And yet that same kindness opens doors we never knew existed. That everyone carries wounds. And sometimes people find each other not because they're perfect, but because they both know what pain is. And that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid, and still plunging into icy water, still standing up each morning, still opening your heart even after you've been hurt too many times. If this story touched you, if you saw a part of yourself in Bryn or in Kane, please hit like, please share so more people can hear this story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you won't miss similar stories every day. How do you feel about Bryn's journey? Have you ever had to choose between kindness and your own safety? Share your feelings in the comments below. We always read and cherish every line you share from your heart. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.